Hello, this is Liz Bramlett coming to you from our training center, and we're going to talk the next few minutes about how you calculate the replacement housing payment required when you must apply the provisions of the Uniform Relocation Act of 1970. When URA applies, a resident is going to be displaced due to a rehab that is funded with federal dollars, such as when a low-income housing tax credit project has home funding. To bring home into the picture, you have to start thinking about whether or not your plans will require you to comply with the provisions of the URA. Under URA, a resident is eligible to receive what's called a replacement housing payment. And let's find out how they're made eligible. A tenant who's going to be displaced from a dwelling is entitled to this replacement housing payment not to exceed $7,200 for rental assistance. So it's money they're going to receive to help them rent an apartment someplace else. And they qualify if they have actually and lawfully occupied the displacement dwelling, the unit they're being displaced from, for at least 90 days immediately prior to what URA refers to as the ION, the initiation of negotiations. If they've rented or purchased and occupied a decent, safe, and sanitary replacement dwelling within 1 year, unless the owner extends this period for good cause after the date they move from their displacement dwelling, the unit they're being moved out of, how much they will actually receive shall be 42 times the amount obtained by subtracting the base monthly rental for the displacement unit. In other words, how much they're currently paying for rent from the lower of the rent and estimated average cost of utilities for a comparable replacement dwelling, or the monthly rent and estimated average monthly cost of utilities for the decent, safe, and sanitary replacement unit they have actually occupied. Now, that base monthly rental for the displacement unit, for the unit that they are moving out of, is calculated as the lesser of the monthly cost for rent and utilities at that unit for a reasonable period of time leading up to when they were displaced, or 30% the household's average monthly gross income. It qualify as a low-income tenant, and under the URA, this means a person whose income is below 8% of AMI. The base monthly rental assistance shall be established solely using the first calculation for persons whose income is above the low-income limit. This provision here, 30% of their average gross income, only applies, is only an option for calculating the replacement housing payment for somebody whose income is below 80% of the AMI. Or the option is the total of the amounts designated for shelter and utilities if the displaced person is receiving a welfare assistance payment for a program that designates the amount for shelter and utilities. Who is speaking of here are welfare recipients in states that have as-paid welfare systems like we have in New York. In New York, the welfare a household receives is broken down into two components. They get one component is paid for their basic needs. The second component is referred to as the welfare rent, and that's the maximum amount they can receive through welfare for their rent and utilities based on their household size. And welfare rent is what they're referring to here, the total amounts designated for shelter and utilities through their welfare program. So here's an example. The base monthly rental for the displacement unit, the unit the household has to move out of, is $900. The monthly rent and utilities estimate for their replacement unit is $1,050. they are over 80% of the AMI, so we don't have to worry about calculating 30% of their average income. First of all, figure out what is the difference between their replacement unit and their displacement unit rent. Difference between the two is what? $1,050 minus $900 is $150, and they can get that up to 42 times. So 150 times 42 payments means they'll qualify for a total replacement housing payment of $6,300 and a maximum of $7,200. So they're well below that. They can easily qualify to receive replacement housing payments of $6,300. Example. The base rental amount for the unit they're being displaced from is $900. Placement unit, the average amount is monthly rent and utilities that we're shooting for here is $1,050. In this case, the income is below 80% of AMI. So we figure 30% of their monthly income, which comes out to be $850. That's less than $900. So we use $850 in our calculations because we're told for a low-income person to use the lesser of the two, the lesser of the rent for the displacement unit versus 30% of their monthly income. So we take $1,050 in the projected rent for the replacement unit, subtract the $850, the tenant's average, 30% of the tenant's average monthly income, and that's $200, times 42, give them a maximum replacement housing payment of $8,400. So that comes to our head is that, okay, that means they're really only going to get $7,200 because we know that that is capped at $7,200, the maximum replacement housing payment required under the URA currently, and it's been raised within the last year. It's been raised up to $7,200. It was $5,250 for a long time. Now it's $7,200. But there's something else you need to keep in mind. When replacement housing payment of $7,200 is less than the resident needs, as in this example, when you ran the math, they needed more than $7,200. The owner should seriously consider if they apply URA's housing of last resort measures. And that often means you're talking about a resident where if you follow just the standard URA procedures, they're going to get enough help to actually rent out a decent place to live. The URA wants to try to make them whole. That's what this is all about. And so one of the easiest ways to implement housing of last resort measures is to just increase their replacement housing payment to a level that would guarantee them affordability of new units. And officials have said, there are HUD officials that are specifically designated as relocation specialists, and they know these requirements well and are serious about making sure they are implemented properly. And officials have said that an owner should have a good explanation as to why they did not treat a comparable situation, as we just looked at, as one calling for housing of last resort measures. So please keep that in mind. To disbursing the replacement housing payment. A assistance payment may, at the owner's discretion, be disbursed in either a lump sum or in installments. Either way, the full amount vests immediately, whether there is any later change in the person's income or rent, or in the condition or location of the person's housing. Once it is calculated, you, as the owner, are responsible for providing that amount as a replacement housing payment for somebody you're displacing, where the URA kicks in. Now, a displaced person can purchase a unit instead of renting, and a displaced person who purchases a replacement unit is entitled to a down payment and to be their assistance in the amount the person would otherwise receive if they were just renting a place. And the owner may decide to increase their total assistance up to $7,200. So if they ran the math, the replacement housing payment the resident came out to be less than the $7,200, the owner can increase it up to $7,200 as it's helping create a larger down payment for its resident. The amount of the replacement housing payment for down payment assistance must, very important here, be applied to the purchase price of the replacement dwelling and any other incidental expenses that come with purchasing somebody. So those other buyer's costs that kick in when you buy a piece of real estate. So they want to make sure that somebody doesn't get a nice lump sum to buy an apartment, let's say, and that money gets wasted elsewhere. They want to make sure the money is used to help them get into a decent place to live. Available, at least 3 comparable replacement units should be examined, and the payment computed on the basis of the unit that is most like the unit they're being displaced from. So it's most nearly representative of or near equal to what's referred to as the displacement unit. If the site of the comparable replacement unit lacks one of the major exterior attributes, one of the major amenities that the tenant is used to, the unit they're being displaced from, then that value should be subtracted from the acquisition cost of the displacement. Extent feasible. Replacement unit shall be selected from the neighborhood in which the displaced unit is located, or, if that's possible, nearby or similar neighborhood, housing costs are generally the same or higher, no lower. If they want to keep these people whole, they want to make them whole as they're being displaced. So they want them to be displaced into a comparable situation or something better. They don't want them displaced into what would be considered a lesser or worse housing situation. 2 or more occupants move to separate units. Each occupant is entitled to a reasonable prorated share of relocation payments that would have been made if the occupants moved together to a comparable unit. Determined that 2 or more occupants maintained separate households within the same dwelling that has a separate entitlement to relocation payments, and have fun working with that situation. That is not an easy situation to deal with. Now, before making a replacement housing payment or releasing the initial payment from escrow, the owner should inspect the replacement dwelling and determine that this money that's being spent really will help make the tenant whole, that they are moving into a unit that's at least as good as where they live, that it is decent, safe, and sanitary. And one of the situations you might run into is you have a resident who goes out and they find a unit, but it isn't as good as they deserve to have, but they think it's all they can afford based on the replacement housing payment you're talking about with them. It could be that that's going to end up being a housing of last resort situation where you're going to have to increase how much the replacement housing payment should be in order to get them into a decent place to live that's at least as good as where they're being moved from. Now, let me know if I can help you in any way with your URA requirements. They're up more and more frequently in the developments that are being renovated through a variety of programs. We have certainly a lot of acquisition rehab tax credit projects where the URA can kick in. We have RAD conversions, and HUD has said very clearly that when a project goes through a RAD conversion, that URA applies to everybody who's going to be displaced. And as a matter of fact, RAD takes URA and ups the ante and adds additional resident protections for the existing residents. So please let me know if I can be of help. You have my website here, my phone number, and my email address. And you can follow me on Twitter, and please do connect with me on LinkedIn. Look forward to talking with you in the future.